the West needs to be worried about this. Of course, look, hypersonic by definition means greater than Mach 5 and able to maneuver. Ballistic missiles quite often reach those sorts of speeds, but they tend to be on a sort of more preset parabola. So anything that can travel at greater than Mach 5 and can maneuver is a concern. Of course it is. And in the cat and mouse game of warfare, this is an advancement. It's one we've seen before. Russia have called it before with their handful of super weapons, as they describe them. So it's not the first time we've seen hypersonic missiles released. It's not the first time we've seen their capabilities kind of set out in glossy brochure terms as if this is the end of warships. But anything moving greater than Mark 5 that can then maneuver as it heads towards you, of course, needs to be taken seriously. And defensive measures that can defeat that need to be taken very seriously as well. Noting that, of course, once it's in the air, that's a problem. But there are many, many steps before that where you can potentially defeat this potential threat. It is a kill chain. Right. The first thing they have to do is establish where their target is. And I think this is often overlooked in the business of targeting ships at sea, because people tend to think of these things in terms of over land where tracking is easier. But if you're at sea hundreds or thousands of miles away, establishing the location of a target that's moving and taking measures specifically to avoid being detected is surprisingly difficult. And it's even harder to do it without the potential target knowing you're doing it. And then if you're in a warfighting situation, well, you can then counter the counter, if you like. You can strike the weapon system. You can strike maybe even the satellites that are doing the tracking, whatever it is. Finding an accurate position that's time sensitive enough to fire a missile like this at is very, very difficult, despite what Hollywood and internet enthusiasts will tell you. It's hard to do. So, but let's assume you then get all of that in place and you fire this missile, all of that has gone seamlessly, no one's fired back at you, you then fire this missile. Now you do have a problem, and you have lead defense if it's around the aircraft carrier, but it's a two-way thing. It might be very difficult to defend against, but it's also very difficult to make that technology work reliably. At some point, this missile is going to have to take a course correction. Now, if you're traveling at hypersonic speeds, you can't defy physics. You create a plasma cone around the nose of the missile that makes communications and any kind of forward visibility very, very difficult. So quite often these missiles will slow to take almost a sort of bearing check, alter course. And at that point, they're vulnerable. And this is where Patriot has had some success against the Kinzhal Russian hypersonic missile over land. Again, one of Putin's super weapons has been destroyed on occasions by a relatively old piece of kit in Patriot. So again, it's not these missiles, they are defeatable. It is cat and mouse. It's not a case of this having catastrophically reduced all warships to rubble. That is not the case. It's just the case of this sort of, chasing the weapons around and trying to improve your ability to defend against them. And if you think of drones like the lorry launching 50 or 60 or 100 or a Chinese light show over, that's the wrong mentality. You're talking hundreds of miles. So anything that can bridge that, going to be quite expensive, quite big, probably quite slow. I mean, drones at that range start looking like really slow and quite poor missiles. Not necessarily. And if you can build 10,000 of them and launch them all simultaneously, okay, that's one thing. But again, you're going to give indicators and warnings that this is happening. This isn't happening in a bubble. The good guys are looking at the bad guys going, well, why is this happening here? So it's a much more complex proposition to swarm drone a ship at sea, particularly one that's miles out to sea. If you go to Iran and you're in the Persian Gulf, then that's a different proposition. And this is something that navies have been preparing for decades. Fast attack swarms from the IRGCN are identical. Again, this isn't new. It's just a movement in the cat and mouse that we need to be wary of. But back to my original point, swarming a warship at sea, particularly a carrier or something in the middle of a layered defense, is much harder than I think people realize. Yeah, I mean, the rate of build is quite extraordinary, isn't it? On the one hand, I'm saying, well, this is cat and mouse, but the cat is moving very, very fast. They're building in tonnage terms, the equivalent of the Royal Navy every 2 years. I mean, it's eye-watering, and you just know they've got really smart people coming up with new kit at an incredible rate. It is impossible to know on open source who's got what, special equipment for defeating or for deterring or whatever it is. We will never know that, and rightly so. But you can't help but look at the rate of Chinese productivity and innovation and go, and be impressed by it and worried by it. Yeah, the threat of invasion, of course, is the one that really focuses everyone's mind. I I'm not so sure. I see harassment every day and bullying and what we would call piratical behavior at sea, really clumsy. And some of it's, I mean, they cut the bow off their own Coast Guard ship the other week with their warship. I mean, it's hard to comprehend as a fellow mariner what leads to that mindset, but that's the mindset they have. So when we war game these things, whoever's playing the red team, as it's called, i.e., the enemy team, needs to think that way. And this is an environment where harassing a Filipino ship, they're happy to be so aggressive, they miss it by yards, and then they hit their own ship, and then they don't stop and they carry on pursuing. This is a war-like mentality. So any war game that involves Taiwan needs to have that in the back of their mind. But I struggle with the idea of an invasion. I know they're building kit that makes it look very like that's the end state. But I've always had in my mind that this will be more of a sort of they'll just they'll just be there one day. They'll be there in response to a natural disaster or something, and they'll go to help. And now they're in, and it's this sort of boiling frog mentality that they've taken in much of the way they've expanded across into the South China Sea and out to the Nine Dash Line. It's about normalizing exceptional. And I just think if you were China and you've got all this kit and the proximity, you're playing a home game here. I don't see that. I see this as a much slower burn where one day they're just there and they're looking at us going, what are you going to do about that? And we look to the Americans and go, what are you going to do about that? And so that I think is probably more likely. But yeah, the messaging, the equipment build is unambiguous that is their intention to end up there one day.